Hi guys, this is another video going through an example of where exam questions repeat themselves, where you come across similar questions year after year. This time we're looking at chemistry paper 1 and we're looking at questions on ionic bonding. I didn't have to look far to find these. I found them in the first two papers I looked in. So they're very, very common. It'll be a different compound each time, but the question is basically the same. So let's go through them both. Magnesium oxide. This is magnesium oxide, is a compound formed from magnesium and oxygen. Describe what happens when a magnesium atom reacts with an oxygen atom. You should refer to electrons in your answer. And down here, this question is about ionic compounds and electrolysis, but this question here doesn't really use electrolysis. Calcium chloride this time is an ionic compound. Calcium and chlorine produce calcium chloride. Describe what happens to calcium atoms and chlorine atoms when the ionic compound calcium chloride is formed. Both are asking about ionic compounds. Both are asking what happens when those two reactants react together, how the ionic bond is formed. This one asks you to focus on what happens to the electrons. This one doesn't specifically say you should refer to electrons, but it kind of indirectly does, because it says describe what happens to the atoms. So the atoms to form ionic bonds must lose or gain electrons. So it's the same thing. So I'm going to show you just how similar these mark schemes are, just how similar these questions are. First point for this one, we're going to say that magnesium atom loses electrons. Or we could say loses 2 electrons. And that is because magnesium is in group 2, so it's got 2 electrons in its outer shell, so it gives those 2 away. The same thing happens to calcium, because calcium is also in group 2. So that's the first point, which you can see is very similar for both. Then the second point is what happens to the non-metal. So oxygen is in group 6, so it's going to gain those 2 electrons. Now down here, our non-metal is chlorine, which is in group 7, so it can only accept 1 electron. But because calcium has 2 electrons to give, we would need 2 chlorine atoms to receive those electrons. So we can say each chlorine atom gains 1 electron. So each calcium atom is going to react with 2 chlorine atoms. And then the final mark for both of these questions involves referring to the ions that are formed. So up here you get magnesium ions formed, which have a 2+ charge. You get oxide ions formed, which have a 2- charge. So magnesium ions are formed, Mg2+, and oxide ions are formed, and they have a 2- charge. And then down here we have, because calcium has lost 2 electrons, we have calcium 2+ ions forming. And then each chlorine atom gains 1 electron, so we have a chloride atom, so it becomes chloride, which has a single negative charge. And obviously we have 2 of those. But we can just say chloride ions, sorry. There you go. You can see how you pick the marks up, how is pretty much identical for both examples. Just to go through it, so for this first answer, you get the first mark for saying magnesium loses electrons. You get the second mark for saying oxygen gains electrons, and the third mark is available for saying that it's 2 electrons. So that mark there is the same as that there. And then the fourth mark is for correctly referring to the ions that are formed. And then for this one, you get the first mark for saying calcium atom loses 2 electrons. That was the first mark. The second mark for saying chlorine atoms gain 1 electron. And then because this is slightly different in that you need 2 chlorine atoms for every 1 calcium atom. You would need to say that to pick up the 3rd mark, which I've done there. So this is the only real difference between the two. Then the 4th mark is for correctly referring to the ions formed. So my advice would be to get one of these or a similar question from another paper onto a flashcard, learn the answer by heart, and then when you get this in the exam, just, adapt it for that. So you would refer to the periodic table, make sure you're getting the number of electrons correct, but it's the same principle for both. These are really common. This is just 2 of many that I've seen. All right, I hope that helps.